Well, good morning and welcome to the Lookouts training session, Negotiating with Landlords with Alin Gosvik. My name is Sarah Kift and I am your host for today. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this project. This is a Housing First Readiness project. The Lookout Society has partnered with Douglas College to do needs assessment with programs across Metro Vancouver in order to develop training that is relevant and timely. And this project is funded in part by the Government of Canada's Homelessness Partnering Strategy. I'd like to introduce our instructor for today, Alin Gosvik. Alin has a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Calgary and a Master's of Social Work from the University of British Columbia. She has been working on housing and homelessness issues for over 7 years, and she has experience in frontline shelter work, policy development, program development, and of course, landlord engagement. She is passionate about housing first, research, social policy, and systems planning. And she believes that the solution to homelessness is housing. It's great to have you here today, Alin.
Thank you, Sarah. It's good to be here. So, I guess we're just going to dive right into engaging landlords. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview as to what we're going to go through today. So we'll start with the housing search and kind of some tips around that and go into getting a viewing. Preparing for that viewing, what to take with you in order to make the process easier, negotiating leases with landlords, building strong relationships, and then, of course, negotiating evictions. So we'll just dive right in to the housing search piece. So some of the housing search can be done on your own or with your client. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. I'm not going to go too much into the different places that you can do housing search because I think that we're all using kind of the same things in terms of Craigslist and PadMapper, even Kijiji. In nonprofits, we're often using all the same methods as other people, which can be quite disappointing to our clients when they find that out. But when you're doing housing search and you're doing it with your client, then of course you can go through and build up their list of what they need. And when you're doing it on your own, there's pros and cons to both. So doing it on your own means that it can be very time effective. You can do it with your work schedule and when you need to do it, kind of in between tasks. If you're doing it with clients, it does help to build that relationship with them and understanding their housing needs. So understand that doing it on your own means building a relationship with the landlord independently. So this is something that your client should really know that you're doing and you should have permission to do from your client, because if you're going to build this relationship with the landlord, you're going to have to facilitate the relationship with the client eventually. And there is information you'll have to share about your client, so it's important that they know you're doing it and that they know what you're going to say and they've told you what they're comfortable with sharing. Make sure you give your client all of their options as to how to do housing search and make sure they understand why you would do things in certain ways. So letting them know, like, look, we can sit down and do it together. We'll set out some time, but also knowing that that does constrain you to only doing it at that time. And if they don't show, then the housing search doesn't happen. So letting them know that you know, you could do it on your own a little bit and set up appointments and then get them to come to appointments, just making sure that they understand that. So I think one of the easiest ways to do it on your own is to sit down with the client first and break down their housing needs. You need to understand what happened in their housing situations in the past, because that's often the greatest indicator of what's going to happen in their housing in the future. So if they had a place where they got evicted because of noise complaints with parties, then maybe you need to find a place that is a little bit more lenient about that. If they got evicted for smoking, then you know you need to find a place that's going to allow them to smoke. And so I find it really helpful to sit down and ask them, look, what do you absolutely need to make this housing work? Like, what's going to be a deal breaker if it doesn't happen? If they're never going to be happy in a place that doesn't have laundry, then most likely they're not going to work to keep a place that doesn't have laundry. So it's good to have a good list of exactly what they need. From there, I really do like to ask my clients, like, look, if you had the perfect place, what do you want in it, so that they can build a bit of a wish list with housing, and knowing that there's probably things they're not going to get in their unit, but that way you have a good idea. So if you find a unit and you're like, wow, like this place is really great, but it doesn't have this, but it does have this, you can share that with the client and say, you know, like, here, I got some of the things on your wish list and I got all the things that you need, so let's arrange a viewing and go and see this place. So then we get to the point of getting a viewing. So if you're doing this independently from your client, then you've got to kind of know what you're going to be sharing with landlords. If you're doing the housing search with your client, then it's kind of on them to share what they want to share and to try and get a viewing. You might run into some barriers with that. Like, so oftentimes our clients overshare information and it kind of stops them from even getting in the door. So if you're doing it with your client, I would advise you to kind of talk to them about what to share anyways, and it would be very similar as to what you're going to share if you're doing it on your own. So I'm going to talk a lot about doing it on your own because I find that that's often what we end up doing anyways when clients don't show up, or we just need to kind of get things done in very short time frames. So I think one of the key things here is creatively telling the landlord what they need to know. So landlords are going to want to know everything they could possibly ask about a potential tenant, and it's up to us to really only give them the information that they need. So, you know, if they don't ask, does the person smoke? You don't need to disclose that. If they don't ask their age, you don't need to disclose that. If they ask what they do for work, you can be very creative in that. I've told people, you know, I have clients who are on welfare, but let's say the work they've done in the past is something that you can talk about, you know, like you can say, oh, well, you know, they're a landscaper by trade or something like that. So you don't have to go into detail as to what their specific job is. You can talk about what they do, or you can talk about volunteer work that they do. Some landlords will be very knowledgeable, and they'll ask you straight out, are they on welfare? I wouldn't ever advise lying to a landlord about this, but I think it's just a matter of not disclosing if they don't ask. Being honest but not giving out unnecessary information. You don't want to set up a relationship with a landlord where they feel like you tricked them into renting this place. So you need to be honest when they ask you direct questions. But if they don't, I think you can really leave out that information that's only going to create stigma against your client. One key point is to be as vague as possible. Just get the viewing set up. So I find that oftentimes I'll just send out a quick email. I won't explain anything about my role as a service provider or that I'm looking for someone else. I'll just say, hey, I'm interested in your suite. I have references and damage deposit. Could I get a viewing? And so that'll kind of get your foot in the door because it's much harder for a landlord to turn you away when you can explain the situation face to face. If you just send an email saying, I'm a service provider, I'm looking for a client, they likely won't even respond. So this can be a fine balance because you don't want to waste your time going to a ton of viewings that aren't going to go anywhere because the landlord's just not interested in renting to you. So know your client and know how it's going to present. If you have a client who really doesn't present well to a landlord and has a ton of issues and is going to need a very understanding landlord who wants to help, then it's not really going to work in your favor to go to all these viewings of these suites where you have competition with 20 other people. It's just going to end up wasting a lot of your time because the landlord's not going to rent to you anyways. However, if you have a client who, you know, this client really just needs some help getting into housing and they're going to be pretty all right to take care of the place on their own, then I'd say this tactic can work really well. So it's all about knowing your client and knowing their needs and understanding kind of what their challenges are going to be in housing. And this starts from the very beginning. I think once you have the viewing set up, then you can kind of roll with it and you can talk to a landlord and really get them to understand what you need to rent. So I've had landlords who are very open once I explain it in person and who, you know, they're really interested in being a part of what we're doing and they're interested in helping out their community. And then I have landlords who the minute they find out welfare is involved, they're not interested. So it can be good too to gauge kind of the landlord from that sense. So my advice is when you're getting a viewing to get them on the phone before you go. Over an email you can't really gauge anyone, but if you're talking to them on the phone you can get a sense of what kind of landlord they are right away, and they'll ask you some questions. So what they ask you is also going to indicate to you what kind of landlord they are. If they need to know everything up front before you even set up a viewing, that's going to tell you that they're probably going to be very involved in knowing what happens in their suite. If they just let you see the house and will rent to you without even knowing your client, that's a pretty good indicator that they're not going to be involved at all and they might be a little bit more laid back. So, and I've seen both. So timing is key. The sooner you can go to a viewing, the better. If you're doing housing search, you have to be prepared to go to a viewing that day because oftentimes the landlord will just have an hour and they'll want you to come and see it. And if you try and set up an appointment for 3 days down the road, chances are the place will already be rented. So when you're doing housing search, either with your client or on your own, just be prepared to jump out of your seat and go right then and there. This can be really tricky and the hard part of doing it with your client, because oftentimes, we're trying to set up appointments. It can take an hour just to get to the housing search piece because you have to go through so many other things, just preparing them to look and talking about what they need. And so it can be very time consuming to do this. That being said, I think it's fully worth it to do it with your client. I just think there are tips to do it without that can kind of minimize any of the missteps that might happen from doing it alone. So if you're doing it alone and you're going to go to a viewing that day, again, your client needs to know that you're going to viewings for them, so that they can be fully involved in the process in their own way, and just making sure that they have the option if they want to go to the viewing with you. I think it's best if clients can go to the viewing with you, because they can kind of sell themselves, and then they can be the one who's telling the landlord things about themselves, and you don't have to worry about any of the confidentiality stuff that goes along with going on your own. Because landlords are going to ask you questions when you're there in person, and you have to know what your client is comfortable with you sharing and not sharing.
It sounds like, Alin, that it's very important to get that first meeting with your client and find out what they need and want, and get all of that sorted ahead of time before you start looking for places, hey?
Yeah, and I think often we've had relationships with our clients for a lot longer. When we're doing the housing search, maybe we're looking at a second or third place for them in the last few years. And so it's really important to know their needs and wants, as well as what has been a problem for them in the past. I can't stress that enough, that when you're looking for housing for someone, you have to know their housing history. It's one of the biggest indicators as to what's going to work well and what isn't. All right, so let's say you get a viewing, you've been on the phone or sending out emails, and you get a viewing that day, and you're going with or without the client. One of the biggest things about securing a suite, or once you get to a viewing, is that money talks. This all depends on what your program is able to do. So if your program has funding to pay a damage deposit or first month's rent or something like that, then it's really key that you're able to do that right away. Landlords are going to trust the situation if they get money in hand right away. If it's always a promise of money and it's going to be 5 days later, that's how they're going to expect the rent to come then, which we all know with our clients is actually a reality, that oftentimes rent can be late and not everyone is good at paying on time. So you need to set up that relationship from the beginning, that you understand that this is a business relationship for your landlord, and that they're there to exchange money for this suite, and it's not just about helping someone, which can be really great. There's a lot of landlords out there who really do want to help their community, but at the end of the day, the bottom line is that they're renting the suite and they need to see the money for it. So if you're able to, it's really great to be able to take damage deposit there. So if the person is interested in renting to your client, the lease can be done on the spot and you can exchange the damage deposit. One way that our program has done this, and it's entirely up to your program and how it's able to work, but we do have one check in the case of an emergency, that if we don't give this check to the landlord right away, then we're going to lose the suite. Then we can pay a damage deposit, and the check is controlled by the program manager, and it has to be authorized still, but pretty much it can be done the day of. We don't have to wait for any of the processes of asking for the check from our finance department. So that's one way we found to kind of do it and be able to secure suites really quickly. But again, that's entirely up to your program and how they work, and if you even have damage deposits available. So something to, again, talk to your client about before you go into the housing search is, how are we going to make sure the landlord gets paid if they do want to rent to you? You need to know, does the client have cash to give the landlord for first month's rent from their welfare check, or are they going to have to go to welfare and apply for the first month's rent to be paid directly to the landlord? Are they even willing to pay directly to the landlord? If you go into meeting with the landlord with or without your client and you have all the information as to how the financials will work out, it sets up a good tone for the landlord to really trust that you understand what the relationship is, and that you're not just trying to get someone in and as quickly as possible. You need to really show that you're going to work with the landlord just as much as the client. Be prepared to offer the damage deposit. It holds the suite, and it sets the tone for the landlord that, like, look, we take it seriously that this is a source of income for you. You have to respect that this is the landlord, this is a job for the landlord, whether he's renting out his own personal basement suite and this is the only place he has, or if it's a property management company that has hundreds of suites. This is a source of income and it's a job. So that's why the money is important. It sets the tone that I respect the business side of this, and I'm not just, as much as we're working for our clients to have better lives and for them to get housed and to move forward, you have to respect their end of this as well. And I'm not just going to support my client. Even if they mess up, I'm going to be a negotiator here and a mediator in the middle to make sure that everyone is happy. So negotiating a lease. This one is tricky, and I have some experiences in the last few weeks that have really been setting me back with this. I have a client right now who will not sign a lease. This person is just very, very adamant that a lease is unnecessary and you've never needed leases before in this city, and they don't want to tie themselves into anything that they might not be happy in. And then if they want to leave, they have to, like, there's all these things. They're thinking very far ahead, and they're very nervous to sign a lease, and so they will not sign one. And the reality is, nowadays, I mean, you're not going to find someone who will rent to you without a lease. And if you do, it's probably not a very nice place to live. I have seen a few places where landlords will just take cash and let you walk in and not do that, and they have not been nice places. So the lease is a tricky one for this person in specific. And we've done a few things to work with that, and it's come back to bite us in the butt, but we're still working on it. So when it comes to negotiating a lease, you have to balance your client's needs and the landlord's needs. Most landlords want a 1-year lease. It gives them peace of mind that they're not going to have to find a tenant again. And most clients will sign a 1-year lease and they're like, yeah, sure, no problem. I've negotiated 6-month leases in the past, especially with a nervous landlord. So if a landlord's very nervous to rent to you or your client, you can say like, well, how about we do a 6-month fixed term lease where we agree to move out at the end. If you're happy with us at the end of 6 months, we'll sign another 6-month lease, and then we'll go month to month from there. So just letting them know that, like, look, you don't have to rent to us and have it be a huge forever thing. If you're that nervous about it, you want to make sure that the rent's getting paid and the suite's taken care of. Let's do a short-term, fixed-term lease. And then it also protects your client, because I've seen clients get burned by landlords before and have horrible landlords who they just don't want to stay in that place anymore. And you can say, like, look, this gives you an opportunity to test out the place, make sure it fits for you. But both parties need to understand the legal side of that, of what that means. So if you have a fixed term lease, like, you have to leave at the end. If the landlord says, like, no, I don't want you out, like, you have to leave. And he can give you that 1 month notice when you're coming up to a month, and he doesn't have to give you that last month free or anything like that. So if you're on month to month and the landlord wants you out for no reason other than he just wants you out, you've got to give the 2 months notice and the last month free. If you're on a fixed term lease, that's not really the case, right? So, but it can put both sides at ease that they're not in this agreement for very long. It's just, they're just testing it out. So I've seen that work. And then I've seen landlords who want a 1-year lease no matter what. Making sure that the client, knowing what the client wants, again, like that one client who will not sign a lease, and another client who, they want a 1-year lease because it protects them as long as they're paying their rent on time. Basically, like, they're safe in their house, and they can't really be evicted without at least some compensation from the landlord. So this one I think is important when you're talking with landlords about how involved you will be. It's always going to be dependent on your client's levels of need. So when you're talking with a landlord about your involvement and you're negotiating the lease, it's like, okay, let's say this is a 6-month and then it's going month to month, or it's a 1-year lease. For that 1 year, you need to know if you're going to be involved that entire year, first of all. So it just depends on your program and how it's set up. If you're meant to follow this client for 1 year or 6 months, and the landlord needs to know that up front. So if they're signing a 1-year lease, but you're really only allowed to follow this client for 6 months, the landlord needs to know that after 6 months, you're really going to be stepping back, and it's going to be the responsibility of the client. So if that's going to determine the length of the lease for the landlord or for the client, then that's important to know. And also the landlord needs to know just how involved you will be. So for our program, because we're sending a monthly rent subsidy to our landlords for a lot of our clients, a lot of the landlords I'm very involved with at least once a month when I'm sending them the rent checks, and I call to make sure that they got it and everything like that, especially for some of our very higher level or higher acuity clients who the risk of them losing their housing is very high, and I want to make sure that everything's going well. So I'll let the landlord know, like, look, you can expect to hear from me at least once a month, or you can expect to hear from me every 2 weeks. Or let's say the landlord lives upstairs and you're coming to visit the client once a week. You can just stop by and say hi to the landlord at that once a week kind of level. So I think it's really important that all parties know that level of involvement when you're signing the lease, because that way there's no surprises and no blaming that can go on. So one thing that our program has done that has been both really good and also very risky is we've signed leases as an agency. So we've had this one individual I'm thinking of that I was speaking of earlier. That person does not want to sign a lease, so we signed a lease. We put the lease under the agency's name, and she pays us the rent. Her $375 portion, we pay the full rent to the landlord. So this kind of helped because the landlord didn't want to get money from multiple places. So one check comes from our agency and then we collect the money back. It depends on if you have the freedom to do that in your program or not, but it is a really flexible way to offer a landlord and a client options. Like, look at, okay, no one's really comfortable with this situation yet. Here's what we can do. And we call it a convertible lease. The whole idea is that the agency signs the lease, takes on the responsibility for 3 to 6 months of making sure the rent is paid, the place is taken care of, everything like that, until both the landlord and the client are more comfortable with each other and more comfortable with the process of housing, and then they sign another lease under the client's name. So you convert the lease over to the client. You could even, let's say the client after 3 months is doing really well and it's very obvious that they can take on their own lease, you could transfer that lease then. And I would advocate to you to do it sooner rather than later, because that's one thing that we didn't do in this case, and I'm really wishing we had now. Because I'll speak about this at the end when I talk about evictions, but that's your responsibility as well if that's happening. So technically, I am this client's landlord. I'm their support worker and their landlord, and I pay their rent and I collect their rent. And so it gets messy. It's a messy lease for sure, not easy. Not easy to negotiate, but making sure that you understand how flexible you can be in that, because some programs won't let you be that flexible and other programs are like, let's try this out and see what will happen. So just understand that when you are doing that, you are taking on a risk as an agency, and you need to make sure that everything's covered there and that your funding won't be at risk or anything like that. You want to make sure of all those things before you go into that. So we've done that in a few instances. We did it with a couple single suites, just scattered sites, and then another thing that we did is we rented a whole house. I stole this model. I say stole, but I borrowed this model from some youth housing that I worked in the past. Works really well for youth because youth are much more open to shared living and everything like that. But we were struggling so much with housing that we decided to try it with adults. You can only go up to 5 bedrooms because you can't have more than 5 unrelated individuals in a house before insurance gets tricky. And before it becomes no longer just a rental house and you look at like rooming houses and stuff, and that changes everything for a landlord. So 5 bedrooms, we've done 4-bedroom houses as well. And so our agency takes on the lease of the whole house, and then we sublease each room to our clients. So every client has a lease with me, a month-to-month lease with me as their landlord, and they pay me their rent. And that way the landlord of the house gets all one check, and he's super happy with it because it's hard to rent out a whole house. Lots of people don't have the income to do that. And no landlord wants to deal with renting to 5 individuals and getting 5 different checks, right? So we've had it work really, really well for us. I would be very cautious about who you place in these 5-bedroom houses. You don't want 5 people with the highest acuity of anyone you ever worked with all in one house. And you also want to give opportunities to people with high acuity to live in these spaces, because it does create very low barrier housing. It's very, very cool to see, like, you can walk up to someone who's been unable to find housing for years and years and say, like, do you want to live here in this place? Yes, it's shared. It's not ideal. We would love to get you your own place. We don't have that option for you right now. You can sign a month-to-month lease with us and live in this shared living. We have one guy who is sleeping outside, heavy alcoholic, just not doing well, and we took the risk to have him have a lease with us, and he's now been housed for a year. And the first 3 months were tricky, but the last 8-9 months have been quite calm, and he's doing so well. And so kind of in that situation, we made sure that the person living downstairs with him in this house was not as high of needs and who was a little bit higher functioning in terms of sobriety, and just could act as a bit of a mentor. We did that sort of thing, and we actually just offered this one client like a bit of a, it's like he volunteers with us almost, right? And we give him a higher subsidy to buy a bus pass every month just for the effort that he puts into being a mentor in this house. And that was something that someone else in Surrey told me about doing. What they actually did is they had a house like this, and they would offer one room to someone for free because this person was basically acting as like a peer support worker in the house who lived in the house. We don't have the finances to offer a room for free because we would be losing money on this house, and we're a nonprofit. So, but we do try and offer some perks for the effort he puts in.
It sounds like from your experience and your stories that you just have to kind of think outside the box.
Yeah.
You know, people have a straightforward way of thinking about renting: credit check, standard lease, all of these things. And yet it's sort of the onus is on us as support workers to kind of figure out different ways of getting people into housing.
Just to be like completely upfront, like this sounds like such a great solution to rent these 5-bedroom houses or a 4-bedroom house. Right now, our agency is currently dealing with a house of 4 people. So we rented a second house. We were all keen to do it because the first one worked so well. It's been going for almost a year now. We're like, okay, we can do this. We can take on a second house. Yeah, things did not go well. We found a place really, really easily. This landlord was very keen to work with us. The landlord owned the house next door and lived next door. So problem number 1 was that the landlord could see every little thing that's happening in his house. For sure, in the first house we rented, things happened that I think a landlord would be very spooked by and not very excited about that's happening. You know, like there was someone OD'd and needed to have an ambulance come. They were fine in the end, but I think if the landlord had lived next door and seen the ambulance there once a week, once every couple days for the first couple months, he would have wanted to end our lease. So second house, landlord lives right next door. He can see anytime something happens, and so he's a little too involved. And also then his kids live next door, and he's really worried about the kind of people that were moving in there. And you know, we had a mix of people moving into that house. The other problem with doing this 4 or 5-bedroom house is sometimes you have no idea what this person's barriers are until they move into housing. I've seen time after time that someone moves into housing and what you thought were going to be their issues, not their issues at all. Other issues come to the surface. It's very well documented that people who move into housing after years of homelessness and trauma often have more issues come out in those first couple months because all of a sudden everything's new and it's overwhelming, and so their addictions will suddenly spike or their mental health problems will get much worse. It's kind of like that. It's going to get worse before it gets better kind of thing. Because the landlord lived right next door, we didn't have the freedom to let people go through their first couple months of adjusting and then getting into the groove of it. So we're now facing a very quick eviction from that house, and he wants us out very, very quickly, and we're having to rehouse 4 people in the span of 4 weeks, which is not an easy task to do. We either need to find another house, which I don't think these 4 people should live all together again because that was part of the problem, or we need to find 4 separate suites somewhere. So we're struggling with that, and so I just want to put that out there that like it's not all going to go perfectly if you're doing these creative solutions, and you're going to have to roll with it and deal with some of the downfall of it as well. If you look into that kind of option of a house like that, be cautious about who you place in there and make sure that the roommates can all kind of gel well. And for the house that was a success, we did have a couple move-in, move-out situations where the tenants all didn't get along, but now we found a good balance and everyone seems really good there. So kind of rolling with that. Yeah, it all depends. Anything can happen. That's the other thing is when you're negotiating a lease with a landlord, I think I have this next. Yep. Underpromise, overdeliver. So don't promise something that you're not sure you can follow through on. So I've been very upfront with landlords that, like, this is what I do know, this is what I know will happen, but look, I can't promise I know everything that's going to happen once they move into housing. So let's say you have that rare landlord who you've been able to be very honest with about someone's issues, or if they're homeless right now and this landlord wants to work with them and give them a chance. Be very, very honest that you can't predict everything and you don't have control over this person. They are a human being who has free will, and they're going to do what they're going to do. Here's what I can promise, which is, I can promise to make sure if something goes wrong with welfare, I'll go to welfare and make sure it gets fixed so that you get your rent. And if something goes wrong that you really need support with and you give me a call, I'm going to respond. These are the things that I can promise. Definitely can't promise that if, they're doing something that you don't want them to do, I can't make them not do it. I can talk to them, I can negotiate with them, I can make sure they understand the consequences to their actions, but at the end of the day, they're going to do what they want, and that's not something I can control. And I've gotten into that situation before where a landlord felt like I should be fixing this person's behaviors, and of course I'm doing everything I can to work with the person, but at the end of the day, they're an adult and I can't necessarily control everything. So it's just always better to be able to do more when you've promised less, because it looks better for the landlord and building that relationship that's ongoing. And it looks really bad to a landlord if they feel like they've been told you'll do all these wonderful things and then you can't really follow through because it's very difficult. Just know ahead of time what you can offer in terms of support to the client and to the landlord. So for our program, we offer 24/7 on-call support to landlords and clients. So that's something that we can tell landlords right up front. Like, look, you can call us anytime if there's an emergency. Please don't call me if it's not an emergency, because I don't want to deal with that at 9 o'clock at night. But if there's an emergency, or let's say the landlord lives upstairs and he knows that there's an ambulance there, it's like, I kind of want to know about that and be able to deal with it right away. So you can let them know, like, look, I'm here as support to you. Here's our on-call number. Here's how you get a hold of me. Or if you're only available in business hours, what you can promise is, like, look, if you call me and leave a message at 9 o'clock at night, you're going to be the first person I respond to. So definitely know what you can promise and don't overstep that, but definitely sell what you can promise to a landlord, I think. So, and that's going to help with building the relationship. All right, so building this relationship, being very, very present in the beginning is so important. So from the first step where you're doing the viewings and you're getting all the leases signed up and everything like that, being very present in the client's home is important for both the client and the landlord. I'm not going to speak so much to the importance of being present in your client's home, because I think that's going to come next in another webinar. But being very present with the landlord and making them very aware of your role, what your agency does, how they can lean on you, and how they can help you to do your job, I think is really important. And just, making sure that they know your name and they feel very comfortable calling you, because you want them to call you if something goes wrong. You don't want them to just leave it. So let's say a client went and changed their welfare check and it's not going directly to them and the client didn't pay their rent this month. You don't want that landlord to call you 3 months from now with 3 months owing in rent. You want them to call you the day it didn't come in so that you can deal with it that day, because if your client spends it, very hard to get it from welfare. But if they just didn't get their check, you can go and deal with that right away, and it makes the landlord feel very comfortable that his investment in this house is protected and that you're going to do everything you can to make sure that that gets dealt with. So regular checkups, whether it's a phone call or stop in, I find with landlords who live above the tenant, really easy to just knock on the door afterwards and be like, hey, just was in, like, stopping by to see them and wanted to make sure everything's cool on your end. There's nothing else I can do for you at this point, what do you need? So I'm pretty casual about it with most landlords. It depends on the landlord. I've had property management companies who I go in with a very business type of attitude, because that's what works best for them. And then I have private landlords who, you're just go and talk to them. And
it sounds like this idea of being present is all about making it easier for yourself later. Hey?
Yeah, definitely. So it's going to help you to know what's going on so that you can do the preventative work.
And also, too, this idea of it seems like there's a lot of work up front. I mean, we working in this field, we know that there's a lot of work to be done here, and it's hard work. But I think that you've offered us some good examples of how to go about that. And so just give me an example of like, how much time do you spend then dealing with landlords on a weekly basis? Or checking in with them?
So a big part of my job description is landlord engagement. So I spend a lot of time doing it. So I would say in the last couple weeks, because we've had so many crises, I probably spend about 50% of my time either talking to new landlords or talking with landlords who I've already been working with. Also, just at the end of the month is when I do a lot of check-ins. So I would say, the last week of the month, I'm spending about 40 to 50% of my time dealing with landlords. The rest of the time, it's not as much. I would say like 20% of my job is doing that. In the beginning, I have landlords who I talk to every day of that process, just so, for the first couple weeks, I'm talking to them every day. And then from there, it depends on their needs. So for that 5-bedroom house that I rented that was going really well, one thing that put the landlord at ease is he wanted to do inspections, monthly inspections. So for the first month, once we would go in together, walk through the house, he could ask me any questions he wanted. And I would let all the tenants know and give them 24 hours notice. We negotiated that he would give me 48 hours notice to enter so that I could give 24 hours notice to the tenants. And that put his mind at ease because he could come in and see like, man, people are just living like people. There's nothing going on in this house that's really concerning to me. And so then he was like, you know what, I think we only need to do it every 2 months. And I think it's been about 3 months since our last inspection, and he wants to do another one. I'm like, great. And that actually is a really good thing because, our clients can be kind of messy in this one house. And when they hear the landlord's coming, they tend to clean up a lot. And so it kind of helps us to prevent any sort of hoarding or anything like that. Or if, they've got guests that they know shouldn't be staying that long. We're like, no, they need to leave. They need to go to their own place. Or if they're homeless, come and work with us so we can work on that. But the landlord's coming and they can't have extra guests here. So having that presence of the landlord and us there has helped to kind of keep the house running smoothly, and it's set the landlord's mind at ease. So that it all depends, right? On what the client wants and what the landlord wants. So I also have clients who, after you've done the initial setup, they don't want you really involved. They want to take on the responsibility of their place and they want to deal with it. And so then I'm pretty happy to step back. If someone's more than capable and really wants to be the one involved and wants to be the one who tells me when something is going wrong or something's going well, then I'm like, that's great, because the more ownership someone has in a place, the more they'll work to keep it and make it their own. So, and if the landlord's comfortable with us stepping back, then I'm going to step back and we're going to send them their monthly subsidy checks and we'll do our regular check-ins with the client. The landlord will always know, like, look, yeah, you can call us, but you don't need to. We don't need to do these check-ins all the time. So again, that's when it comes back to what I said, like your level of involvement will depend on your client's needs. And I'm sure this will come into the webinar on keeping people housed, but really there are going to be some people who are like, nope, I don't want you involved. I don't need you involved. It doesn't need to happen. And just in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, I should be more involved here. So then it's going to come into some assertive engagement kind of techniques to both bring the client on board for you being more involved and just letting the landlord know, like, I want to be really involved here, but I also want to give them ownership if this is what they've said they want. You can bring it back to program rules. So for our program, like it's not really an option. We don't have any readiness because of course it's housing first and we want people in housing, but we're pretty upfront that like, look, we're taking on risk here as well as an agency and we need to be involved with your landlord. And I understand that you want to be the one to do it. So if you're staying involved with us and keeping up that contact, then for sure we'll step back and not be so involved with the landlord. But if we're having a hard time finding you or you're not being engaged with us and you're not wanting to work with us, which absolutely is your right, but we're going to call your landlord. And so it's important, again, to have that release of information signed so that you have every right to talk to the landlord. It all depends so much on what your client needs and where they're at and what they think they need. So this one I think is important, especially in the beginning, and has everything to do with the level of your client's needs. You're going to check in with the landlord as often as you would the client. So for me, I'm not a case management support worker. I'm working in management, and I'm also doing the landlord engagement piece for a lot of our houses. And so there's other outreach workers who are doing the support work. So I'm going to be communicating with them about the needs of the client and how often do you feel like you should be doing check-ins with them? If they're like, man, this person needs a check-in like twice a week minimum, I'm like, okay, well, that's how often I need to check in with the landlord then, because I just want to make sure that they're okay with it. And if the landlord's like, that's too much, you're like going to respect that, of course. It's a lot of communication and a lot of talking about what do they need from you. And maybe the landlord doesn't want to be called twice a week, but he might not mind a text that's like, hey, just checking in, making sure everything's all good, a quick phone call to make sure they got their rent at the end of the month, and then, yeah. It's nice if you're kind of doing the landlord engagement and the support work, because you can kind of know exactly what's going on with the client. So for us, it's really important that the outreach workers communicate with me everything that's going on with those clients, so that I can make sure to communicate with the landlord, and we work kind of as a team. So it all depends on how your program is set up too. Higher needs, of course, more regular landlord check-ins. Appreciation goes a long way, and I know this is one thing that's talked about a lot in Housing First, and I feel like for me sometimes I tune it out, but then I remember how important it is to show appreciation to landlords, and coffee just goes a long way, knowing kind of where they get their coffee from. Do they like Starbucks or Tim Hortons or, you know, blends? And just bringing a coffee once in a while, it's of course not going to be every time, but just, you know, bring a coffee. If you have a set meeting with a landlord, bring a coffee, or take them to a coffee shop and get them coffee, you know, like it's just goes to show that you respect the relationship there, and that you really do appreciate the risk that they're taking, because I'm not going to lie, like I've seen some of our clients who have not done very well in housing, and they've really put the landlord in a bad spot. And so I understand landlords' hesitation at renting to a lot of people, because there is horror stories out there of what's happened to landlords. And of course it goes both ways. I've seen horror stories of what happens to tenants from landlords as well. But I just always want to show that I appreciate the risk that they're taking, and appreciate that they want to be a part of the solution. They want to be a part of this solution to end homelessness in our community, and this is how they're doing their part. So making sure that they feel that. I've done gift cards too, just like a $20 gift card after, let's say we went through all the negotiation of the lease and everything like that, and it was that really time-intensive stuff, and the person's all moved in, and you're going to start just doing those regular, like once a week, once a month check-ins. Then right before you kind of transition to that, just a gift card and a thank you note is really, really nice. Is there any questions about that piece of building the relationship with the landlord, or any suggestions of other things people have done?
Or even things that people are struggling with,
Yeah.
In terms of negotiation, or questions that are really on your heart to just pop in there. It's interesting to reflect on how so much of this is about how we work with people, hey?
Yeah.
You know, there's the paperwork, there's the requirements, there's the needs of the agency, but really at the end of the day, a good housing solution is about building a good relationship, hey?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's true for anyone. I think you always have a relationship with your landlord one way or another.
Now, this is a good question, actually. Are there any suggestions for sort of pre-screening landlords, getting them on board without a specific client in mind, so that you have somebody in mind that you're building a relationship with that you could then take a new client to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done this in the past, and I've had both success and failure with it. So one thing you can do to kind of pre-screen or get a few landlords who know you, that's where property managers really come into play, because they have so many suites available. And so we've done it both ways. We've had a specific client in mind, and we make contact with a property manager who's very, very open to working with us. And from there, we're like, hey, you know what? We'd really like to keep working with you, and we can always promise you you'll never have an empty suite if you keep working with us, kind of thing. So let's build that relationship. And then I've also cold called property managers and just been like, look, this is what we're doing. We're in the same community as you. We have tons of people with housing needs. Here's what we offer as a program. We'd love to work with you. And I did get one suite that way promised to me from a property management company. And then from there, what we did is I told them, like, okay, look, you promise us this suite. You're not going to give it away. Let's find the right tenant for you out of our clients. And so then I set up a couple meetings with them with different clients of ours, and they got to kind of pick. So it was like, clients got to skip the credit check part and all of that, because we were very upfront, like, our clients aren't going to pass that. But the property management still got the process of screening who they wanted in there. I won't lie, this didn't go well, but it was so complicated and complex as to why it didn't go well. So the tenants for sure messed up. They did not do well in housing. And I think that was a little bit on us. I don't think we were present enough, and I don't think we knew enough about their needs to be as present as we needed to be. We kind of, they presented so well, and we thought they would do really well in this place. And so I don't think we were as present as we needed to be. So that's mistake number one. They had tons of issues and did not take any ownership in this place. So that was another problem. The other thing is that the property management company, I think, didn't quite understand the barriers. And I presented them with 2 clients, and I can tell you which one would have done well, but she presented more poorly to them in the first meeting because she came across as very nervous and a little bit aggressive, and they were like, nope, we don't want that. She was a very quiet and clean tenant in the end. And then the people they did chose, they came across as just very easygoing, yeah, whatever, but that in the end they were partiers and very loud and had people coming and going. And so the property management company didn't trust me when I said, like, no, I really think this other person would be a better fit. I knew for the building they needed someone very quiet and very low key, and they didn't trust when I said that I thought this other person would be more fit. So it was everyone kind of contributed to that. So I think that doesn't necessarily mean you can't build relationships without a client in mind. I think you just need to go with the flow of that. And so I just went to a meeting with a property manager the other day. He told me in the email, I've worked with agencies before, no problem, I'm happy to meet with you. I don't think we're going to get this suite specifically because the person I was looking for, he knew too much to ask the right questions, and I couldn't lie. But he has so many suites available, and so we just sat there and we talked for a bit. He asked me what I thought the solution was to our housing crisis, and we just kind of built a rapport. And so now I have the opportunity to just send him a quick email and be like, hey, look, I know that this suite isn't the right fit for the client I had in mind, but here's the different clients I'm looking for right now, and here's what I need. He was very interesting because I could be so upfront with him. He asked me outright, look, what are her issues? I want to know because I know you're an agency and I know she's probably got social issues or addictions issues. I want to know upfront. And I was like, oh, shoot. Like, you know too much to get to the point. And of course, this person I was looking for had prostitution issues and drug overdose issues. And I'm like, doesn't get along with neighbors. And that's everything they don't want. They actually could have cared less about how the rent gets paid and wanted someone who would fit in the neighborhood. So, but now, because he knows so much and what to ask, I can be like, hey, you know what I need? I need a suite where someone can be like that. Do you have anything anywhere in the Lower Mainland? And so we're trying to build that relationship. I think that can work really well.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, sometimes honesty up front might be painful, but it can actually help build a relationship. So that landlord probably knows now that he can trust you in terms of telling him what's going on. Hey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that was my hope. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to put it all out there, and that way also too, when you're putting it all out there with a landlord and they're like, ooh, okay, they're being really upfront. They also know what to expect, and there's no surprises, which can really damage your relationship with a landlord when all of a sudden everything you've said would be good isn't good. So
yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
I've got a question here that might actually tie into this section on maintaining the relationship. So I'll just put it out to you, and then maybe you can get to it a bit later.
Yeah.
And that is, what happens when you go through all these hurdles, you get someone housed, and then they won't talk to you or the landlord once they're housed. So they won't answer their phone or they won't open the door.
Yeah.
And that might be something that you're going to cover as you go along. So I'll just leave that with you.
Yeah. So, and that I think will tie into to the other webinar on how to keep someone housed. I'm not sure. I'm not doing that one. So, but one piece of training that we do with our staff is assertive engagement. So someone who doesn't want to engage with you and how to work with that and how to be pushy when you need to be pushy. If they won't answer the door for the landlord and they won't answer the phone for the landlord, there are ways that the landlord can serve notices to do things. Like, you know, one way to get someone to be around is if they're not answering their phone, just post a 24-hour notice to enter their suite. Most likely they don't want you to enter their suite without them there anyways, so they're going to show up for that.
Yeah, it sounds like we're doing a webinar in our series called Hope-Filled Engagement, which probably sounds hopeful and good to help answer that question in more depth.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I can speak a little bit to what we do in terms of that, and we're pretty low barrier in terms of when people get services from us. But if someone absolutely will not engage and they won't engage with their landlord, and I have a relationship with the landlord, I'm like, look, yeah, you and I are on the same page. They're not working with us. I'm going to have to take extra measures here. And so I'll start sending them letters like, look, if you don't get in contact with us, I can't continue to give you a subsidy. Our only requirement for our subsidy is that we make contact once a month. And if I can't do that, I'm not allowed to keep giving you that. Really want to keep giving you that, so please get in contact with me. And then progressively getting a bit more assertive with like, I'm going to cut off your subsidy if you don't get in contact with me. Of course, the goal is not to cut someone off subsidies, to get them to talk to you. And I don't want someone to feel pressured like they have to participate in that way, but just being really upfront that like, look, if you don't want services, that's fine, but I at least need to know you're okay and how you're doing and that you're still living here. Let's start there. Let's just start with, can you just make sure I know every month that you still live here? So I think starting small and going from there. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about maintaining the relationship because this is something that just gets into the mundane everyday stuff, and it's not that intensive, upfront, exciting house search and securing a lease and everything. I know that's super exciting to everyone. It is to me. So making sure the rent is set up correctly is going to be the first thing that keeps that relationship going. So the rent is going every month. That's going to make the landlord really happy and the relationship go a lot smoother. If the only contact you're having with that landlord every month is to talk about how the rent isn't paid, the relationship's not going to feel so smooth. So that's definitely step one, I think. Regular home visits so that you know the suite is taken care of, and you can assure the landlord that the suite is still being taken care of. One thing that I have seen work really, really well, if you're making sure those regular home visits are happening and you're staying in contact with the landlord, you're going to know about things before the landlord does. So if you know a toilet's broken and something's gone wrong in the suite, I've had where a landlord calls me and he's like, man, your client broke the toilet again. And I'm like, I know, he called me last night. This is what I did to fix it. That looks so much better than like, oh my gosh, really? Okay, I'll get on it. And of course, getting on it as soon as the landlord tells you is really great. That's what you want to do. But it looks really, really good on you if you already know about it before the landlord. Or if like the client, if you have a good relationship with your client, they'll come to you and be like, I spent my rent money this month. And the landlord calls you on the first, or even better, you call the landlord before the first and say, this happened. Here's what I'm doing to address it. Here's when you can expect an answer. And then it just kind of helps to maintain like that trust that you are on this and you know what's going on. Definitely, I think maintaining the relationship, it starts to come to a point where you're not talking to the landlord as much, and then you're going to start to trail off and everything like that. But just as long as the landlord knows that you're still there, that's when I think that maintaining that comes important. As long as the rent's getting paid, there's no major issues, then maintaining the relationship is going to be easy. If your client has major issues that you're having to deal with all the time, then maintaining that relationship is going to take a little bit more effort and a little bit more presence. So I'm just going to, I know this ties into the attitudes of excellence that you guys had put in with part of this training session and everything. So the service part, caring for your clients, will give you all the knowledge that you need really to work with landlords. So if you're doing your work as a support worker, you're going to be able to talk to the landlord about issues that come up. Ownership, comes back to what I said, like knowing what you can promise and what you can't so that it makes it easy to follow through. Initiative, just like I just said, knowing about the issues before the landlord does, and taking the initiative to problem solve and then communicate with the landlord. So people really love when you come to them with a solution rather than a problem, and I think that's true pretty much across the board in any work setting. Professionalism, always following through with what you've said you'll do. Sometimes landlords can cause an emotional reaction in clients, and it's important that we stay professional so that we can support both parties. And I won't lie, I'm not always perfect at this. I've had landlords who make me so angry and so crazy, and what they're doing is so wrong that it's so hard to maintain that professional attitude. But I've had to go back and apologize and say, look, I'm so sorry, that was so unprofessional of me the way I handled that. Or I've had to do that with my clients too because they make me crazy. Just, you lose your cool sometimes. So, but you want to do your best to maintain that professional attitude. And one thing I was thinking about today, because I showed up to this webinar not all dressed up, is sometimes it's nice when you go meet a landlord to have a very professional look. I know sometimes in support work we can, you don't want to dress too fancy because it can alienate you from your clients and everything like that. But sometimes for a landlord or especially a property manager, it goes a long way to have some office casual wear that you're working with. And then commitment. So be committed to the relationship with both your client and the landlord. And different situations will require different levels of commitment. Okay, so I'm going to talk really, really quickly on this last piece because I know we're kind of getting to, we have some time, but I want to have time for questions as well. And this is something I've been dealing with a lot in the last few weeks, is negotiating eviction. So not every eviction is preventable. People are going to do what they're going to do in housing, and some people will get evicted because of it, and some people will be evicted multiple times from multiple different housing situations that they've been in. That's why they're here as clients of a Housing First program. So just know, as a support worker, you can't prevent everything from happening. And not every eviction is negative. Sometimes it's, a situation is not going well and it's time for people to get out, and maybe your client doesn't even realize how much better a housing situation could be and they're not going to get out. The landlord's done, it's not working, and you need to go through this eviction process. It doesn't have to be a negative. It's always, you can always sit down with the client and say, let's talk about what happened and why this eviction happened, and let's learn from it. What did I not give you as a support worker? What did you do that led up to this eviction? What can we do differently? What was wrong with this place that it wasn't the place for you, that we can make sure is in the next place? So it's always about learning. I think it's important to know when to cooperate with the landlord and when to be more assertive, and by assertive, I mean fight with them. Because there are times, so for instance, this 4-bedroom house I have where the landlord wants us out, and the situation that led to it, I can't argue with him. I'm like, absolutely, we need to be out. I won't argue with you. I want to be out. I want to give you everything you need in this, and I want to cooperate with him fully. He's been nothing but gracious with us, and I think he deserves to have an easy process here. So I'm doing everything I can to make sure that happens. I have landlords who are trying to evict clients, and it's not right. The client doesn't deserve it. It's all discrimination, and I am going to fight for my client in that situation. And sometimes it comes down to actually helping your client go through the residential tenancy branch to file all of the paperwork to fight that. Sometimes it's about talking to the landlord and saying, like, look, I don't want to have to go through this process. I want to work with you on this, but I don't think you're right in this situation, and I think this is how we can fix it. Of course, you don't want to just fight with no fix in mind, right? So if you think there's something you can do to salvage the situation, then fight for that. And knowing your client's right, you have to understand both parties' rights and responsibilities to mediate rather than just fight a landlord. You want to mediate the situation. I say fight because the last few situations I've been in have just been so frustrating, and it feels like an uphill battle to fight, and I'm going through a lot of arbitration.
Yeah, and there's also the resource of calling TRAC, which is the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center as well. Yeah. Evictions are never easy. I actually have someone in my family extended family, who's in the process of getting evicted, and it's hard for everyone.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard on the landlord. The landlord risks losing money in the situation. The tenant is losing their housing. As a support worker, you're having to kind of do all the work all over again to rehouse them. So it's not easy on anyone in this party. And I think it's important to make sure the landlord understands how long the process will take. And that's what I mean when I say understanding both parties' rights and responsibilities, and calling TRAC and going to the RTB and just go look for advice. I've gone to the RTB before just to put my situation out there and say, what should I do here? I don't know. This is a gray area. The Residential Tenancy Act doesn't necessarily cover nonprofit housing. Find advice where you can so that you can tell everyone up front what's really going on. Evictions are very, very stressful and time-consuming, and the landlord needs to know that it will be time-consuming on his end too. I have a landlord right now who is making me basically do all of the eviction work for this one place. I've served myself notice, and I've taken myself to the residential tenancy branch to go through this, and I'm both evicting and supporting my client to not be evicted at the same time. It's very, very messy. And I was just trying to be upfront with him that this doesn't happen quickly, and he wants it to happen quickly, and he will not accept that it's not going to.
I really like that you mentioned that it's not all negative and it can be a learning experience.
Yeah.
Can you think of any evictions that have actually gone really well in your experience?
So one thing, I can think of a lot that I've learned as a support worker from an eviction. So I learned, for instance, that one person in this 4-bedroom house does not do well in shared housing. I'm not going to look for shared housing for them again. It's not going to work. I learned that one of the people downstairs is engaging in prostitution. So now I know all of this stuff, and I can make sure that their next house they're not going to get evicted because of that stuff. New stuff may come up, but I know I'm not going to find a place with 3 young kids upstairs for this girl who will most likely engage in prostitution again. And I don't judge, and I understand what's going on there, but I need to make sure that that's not going to cause an eviction for her. I like to look at it as my job is housing, and that's what I do. I look for housing, and I need to know what someone is going to do in housing so that I can find the most appropriate way to house them. So I think I learn a lot every time someone gets evicted. I don't know that necessarily it's always positive in my clients' minds, and sometimes they don't always learn something from it, and it's just traumatizing, and that's awful to watch someone go through. I have seen people talk about what they did wrong, and I think that they will take that into their next place and possibly not do it because they don't want to lose housing again. So there's a lot of learning that goes on, and you learn that, maybe that's a landlord I don't want to work with again, or maybe if I have a landlord that acts very similar, I should know that they're going to do this kind of thing. So usually once you get to the point of an eviction, it's not easy to salvage the relationship with a landlord. Like, let's be honest, we burn some bridges as nonprofits because our clients do things that are not great in housing. And I know when to drop the relationship and when to just stop trying to salvage that because it's not going to happen. So I think that's important too. Don't waste your energy trying to salvage something that probably is not going to be saved. So I've talked a lot about my experiences and some of the things that I've done in terms of engaging with landlords, and I know there's lots of different ways to do things, and every day that I do this job, I learn something new or how to do something. So I'm sure if I did this webinar next month, it would be very different, and I'll have different experiences to talk about, but I would love to answer some questions or hear some feedback from people as to what they're doing.
Yeah, and something that came up earlier, just as we're giving people a moment to reflect and think about what they want to ask you, is this idea of information sharing. So in that situation, I think you were talking about being honest with the landlord.
Yep.
Where is that line? I mean, this is probably something we learn in confidentiality training, where what do you share with them about your client's issues, and what are you holding back on?
So I tend to think of it, I reflect personally, what would I be okay with having shared with a landlord about me, and what wouldn't I be okay with having a landlord know? And so I look at it that way. And then I also am very upfront with my clients that I'm going to have to share some details and making sure they know that up front so that I'm not breaching anything or making them feel violated. If at all possible, it's always best to have those meetings with landlords and the client in the same room so that they can share their information for themselves. And then you don't even have to worry about oversharing or undersharing. So that's always the easiest way, I think, to get around that. But barring that, making sure that confidentiality form is signed, that you can talk to the landlord, and making sure the client understands what you need to share.
And something that sort of I picked up on during the webinar is, this is hard work, hey?
Yes.
And it often takes place outside of regular business hours.
Yes.
And it involves your heart as well as your skill set. So how do you deal with that? How do you wrestle with, carrying the needs of people, negotiating with landlords, and keeping yourself sane?
I try to take it one step at a time, and that sounds so cliche, but I have all these evictions coming up in front of me, and it's hard not to feel very overwhelmed and crazy about it. But I'll just start my day with okay, today I need to take evidence to the RTV, and today I need to serve this notice to someone, and at the same time I should look for a few new places. So that's what I can do today, and as long as I do everything I can in a day, then I go home feeling all right about it, and knowing I've done what I can. And also there's ownership. These are adults that I'm working with. I think it'd be very different if I was working with youth, but these are adults who do have free choice to make, and they make their choices, and they do have to live with the consequences. If someone gets themselves evicted for doing something really stupid, that sucks. I don't want to see that person homeless. I'm going to bust my ass to make sure they don't become homeless. But I also want them to understand, you did this as well. This was your house, and you made these choices.
So this is a really interesting question, because we've been talking a lot about presenting our best selves to landlords on behalf of our clients. But what happens if a landlord lies to you or doesn't present you with all the information? And specifically here, the question is a landlord lying about an eviction. Maybe we need a bit more detail about that, but maybe you could just talk about what happens when landlords aren't upfront with you.
Yeah, so I mean, I've had landlords be very evasive about the quality of their suite, and or you're doing a walkthrough and a few things are kind of broken, like a sink or something like that, and they're like, yeah, I'll fix that before they move in, and they don't. Or I've had landlords lie about if they're going to sell the house or not, because that's something I'll ask people now, especially now in the Lower Mainland. It's so important to say, like, are you looking at selling your house or redeveloping it any time in the next year? Do you have any permit applications in to have your house redeveloped? And they're like, nope, nope, nope. 6 months later, they're like, oh, I got the permit to redevelop my house. Everyone has to be out in 3 months. And you're like, which would be fine. It's fine to find places where the property is going to be redeveloped. In fact, that can be a really great resource because people care less about what happens to their house if they're about to tear it down in a year. But to have them just not tell you that up front and then have your client be super comfortable living there and then know that they have to leave can be very traumatizing, which you can prevent that trauma by just saying, hey, this is going to be a great place for 9 months. And I wish I could promise to you sooner. Do you still want it? And then the client has the freedom to make that choice as to whether or not they want to move in there. So lying about that stuff, unfortunately, there's really not a lot we can do other than kind of shake your finger at the landlord and say, that sucks that you didn't tell me that. Yeah, so it all depends. So I'm curious what they meant, like a little bit more specifics around the lying about evictions.
Yeah, hopefully they'll clarify that for us. Did you have anything else to add? Any personal stories or things that you just really want to make sure people go away with today?
So one thing I think I kind of forgot to mention when I was talking about the viewing and everything, which I think is really important. When you go to the viewing, don't just be prepared with being able to pay a damage deposit. I did this personally to get my own suite, which was its own struggle to find a place to live. Go into that suite knowing the landlord's name if possible. If they have an application, have it pre-filled out. Have your references on a sheet of paper with the phone numbers written out, and have it in a nice, beautiful little envelope that you can be like, oh, here's my application to live here, and it's all so organized. And if you can get your client to hand that to the landlord, it looks just so organized and well put together and gives that landlord a bit more faith in that situation. So that's just one trick that I've used that really, really helps, is to come with more information than the landlord even thinks they need to know, so that they don't feel like they have to ask you a million questions either. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great tip. So if you have any more questions, please email us at development@lookoutsociety.ca. Thank you so much for sitting here with us today and taking this training, and have a peaceful day.